Support Services Coordinator. So if you have any AIC related questions during the program, feel free to drop them in the chat. Steeped in the Islamic values of creational stewardship and justice, all of us at American Islamic College believe that God has entrusted the lands and waters he created to humankind, who were created to serve God and the creation as stewards or caretakers. We also believe that we must stand for justice even when we ourselves may be implicated. So we want to begin today by acknowledging that our campus on site sits on land that was originally entrusted to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, peoples whose sovereignty, culture, and their very lives were violated by colonial policy. Here, just west of where land meets water, is the historical land of the Council of Three Fires, the confederated nations of the Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi nations. We acknowledge and honor them, their descendants, and their land and waterways. We welcome students of all faiths and backgrounds. AIC is a Chicago-based accredited institution of higher learning, grounded in Islamic values and steeped in Islam's rich and diverse intellectual and cultural traditions. We promote an appreciation for the scope and richness of Islamic history, civilization, in the classroom and beyond, through impactful teaching and informative public events such as this, highlighting Islam's intellectual, artistic, and cultural expressions. We offer a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts in Islamic Studies, a Master of Divinity in Islamic Studies and Muslim Chaplaincy, and every summer we host two 10-week Arabic language intensive programs, each equivalent to 2 academic semesters of Arabic study. Tonight, we have a distinguished guest, Rebekah Coffman from the Chicago History Museum, who will be presenting on the Chicago Sacred Initiative. AIC and the Chicago History Museum have had the wonderful opportunity to work on a few projects together over this past year, and it has been such a pleasure getting to know Rebekah and her passion for history and sacred spaces. And as many of you know, Muslims have a deep history in Chicago, as do many communities. It's a fascinating city with a lot of culture, and in many ways is a microcosm of our world, with ethnicities represented from an array of countries. So we look forward to learning more about that tonight. Rebekah Coffman is a historian, preservationist, and curator, currently serving as curator of religion and community history at the Chicago History Museum, where she leads the Chicago Sacred Initiative. Her interdisciplinary work is at the intersection of religious identity and the built environment and explores themes of tangible and intangible heritages and material and visual culture through place-based, community-centered approaches. Please give a very warm welcome to Rebekah Coffman.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Romana. May I just take a privileged second to ensure we can all see my screen and it is the proper screen you're seeing? All right, excellent. Thank you again for the invitation to speak tonight. I'm very honored to have been invited, but also to have gotten to work with Romana as well as Dr. Timothy. And I would be remiss without thanking Dr. Shakila Hassan, who has been absolutely instrumental in facilitating the relationship between the Chicago History Museum and American Islamic College. And there are not enough words to share, I think, about the amazing things that she has done and continues to do. So I'm very grateful, and I'm very excited that we're going to be making plans to do more together through the Hassan Institute for Interfaith Encounter. And so, yeah, it's a true privilege to be included in this work. And I also want to give a quick note that I just noticed my boss is on the call, so I'm going to give him a shout out and thank him for coming too. But we're joined by Charles Bethea, Director of Curatorial Affairs at Chicago History Museum. So, I always begin also with a land acknowledgement, and I see Dr. Timothy, you did such a nice job acknowledging the space we're in already. While we are in close proximity to you spatially in the city, we also have a way of kind of marking the space that the museum resides on. And that's a legacy I think most of us at the museum don't take lightly. And so I won't read it again as it echoes a lot of the sentiment, but this is something that we incorporate into our practice as acknowledging the legacy of many institutions that have reparation to do around the space even that they sit on. If you have not been to our museum, this is us, just as a quick point of orientation. We are just slightly north of the Loop area in Lincoln Park. This is what you would see if you drive by us on Clark Street. Sorry, just 1 minute. I'm gonna go remind my son that he is supposed to be quiet. If you can give me just 1 moment. Thank you so much for your patience. So we, as the Chicago History Museum, have a mission to serve as a place of learning, inspiration, civic engagement, and really to just connect people to history. And I think for me, the most important part is and to each other. So while we talk about history, we are a people-centered museum. And so part of the mission is not just to share and educate, but really to make these connections and to facilitate that. And I think a curator can mean a lot of different things, but facilitating connection for me is certainly a big part of that work. Just a few more words about us if you're not familiar. We claim to be the oldest cultural institution in the city, going all the way back to 1856. And our collections speak to a lot of different histories. We have over 23 million objects in our collection between on-site and off-site storage. We see thousands and thousands of students each year for educational endeavors. And then we also serve as a public research institution. And so what that means is, people in the city can come and use our collections as points of research so that they can connect again to their own sense of history. This is me. You see me on your screen, but just as a reminder, I had the privilege of joining the museum's staff in 2022. So I just celebrated my 2-year anniversary. And my position is a new position for the museum. So I have the title of curator of religion and community history. And I often say that those two words, religion and community, are two words that just about everyone will have a definition of, but most people don't have the same definition. And so that makes it really interesting and challenging to do the work that I do, because we are mutually defining these words together as we're doing this work, because as I define it might shift if I'm in a certain context or in a certain definition of what we might be building as community together. My position was made possible very generously through an endowment by the Lilly Foundation. And so we're very, very honored to get to do this work with their support. I'm going to give just a little background to me as a person. I did have a life before 2022. So something fun about me, but also might explain a lot about me, is I'm a pastor's kid. So I actually grew up with both of my parents as faith leaders. And this is actually just a drawing I posted to Instagram a few years ago, but they started the faith community that they became leaders of, and that meant meeting in our home and many temporary positions over time until they built a purpose-built building over almost 3 decades. And I think that that's a really important thing that I never gave credit to, that led me in the path I did, because really that means they were community organizers, and that means they did a lot of grassroots organizing for the work that they cared about. It also meant that it made me think a lot about what sacred space is, because things can be very fluid when you're moving in and out of different spaces. And so for those two reasons, it can sometimes be challenging to admit the great things your parents do growing up, but in adulthood, you look at it through a different lens. As I went into college, I initially thought I would be a science major, and I actually shifted into a religion and art history double major because I was really compelled by seeing how the stuff that I experienced growing up portrayed itself in visual culture. And so I was actually part of an interfaith group of young scholars at my university that had the privilege of reading works like Acts of Faith and doing that in dialogue as an interfaith group. And I give that a lot of credit for kind of facilitating the vocabulary of what it takes to do interfaith work. And in the art history and history side, I became really interested in how theology informs imagery, or how it informs place. And so these are the kinds of things that I got really connected to in my undergraduate days. Fast forwarding a little bit, I later found myself working in religious spaces in transition. And so these were churches that were in the midst of closing and needing new uses. And I was in the unique position to help kind of facilitate those transitions. And I realized there's a lot that happens in those moments of transition that relates to museum work. And I'll get into that in just a minute. But because of that, I went on to study architectural history. I did that in London for a few reasons. One in part being just the increased secularization and transitions of adapted buildings that was taking place there, and became really interested in, again, these conversations around how space is conceived and how heritage and legacy are formed. And
Rebecca, we're just seeing the title screen, so we missed your drawing.
oh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay.
Well, that's not very fun for anyone. Let's go quickly. All right. Thank you for letting me know. Are you seeing it now?
Yes,
And you're seeing just the full screen.
full screen, yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, that makes this a lot more fun when you see the images, doesn't it?
Thank you.
I'm so sorry. It was advancing on my end. All right. We were here at buildings, right? Okay, thank you. So I wrote my graduate work on something I called Sacred Shift, and that was looking specifically at religious buildings that were built by one religious tradition and shifted into use by new religious traditions. And within that, these conversations around identity became really important into how heritage, but also use were considered going forward. And that got me really interested in these conversations around the static and the living traditions that are a part of our everyday world. And in heritage terms, that becomes tangible heritage would be something like a building, and intangible heritage, which would be the performative action of a religious tradition, right? So that might be prayer, that might be song. And these things are held kind of together while also being held in tension. And sometimes better than others. There are lots of examples of it going well and lots of examples of it being challenging. And, I was looking at examples both of things that transitioned in use within, we would say, the same tradition, but Sacred Shift really looked at examples that shifted between different traditions as places for interfaith dialogue and saying, what are the learning lessons and takeaways we can take when a building doesn't change, but the users do, and how those dialogues are facilitated. And it brings up a lot of topics like what an authentic heritage is. Is it something that the original users have claim to? Do later users have equal claim? And that leads into conversations around dialogue and how we facilitate that. And that could be through the lens of multiculturalism or interculturalism, which is really trying to understand where power sits within these things. Right before I began the museum, I had the privilege of exploring some of these themes in a digital exhibit because it was COVID that we called Tangible and Tangible, and looking at a number of different examples from different countries, different cities around the US of folks who were engaging in this topic in their own work. And that does live, I think, on YouTube still, if you're interested in hearing some of those conversations. Just to double check, the slides are still tracking with me now that I'm worried about that. Okay, thank you. So the initiative at the museum we have that is funded by this lily work is called Chicago Sacred. This could mean a lot of different things. So I'm going to try to walk us through some things, in part in question, in part with some of the answers we came up with, and in part to say there are many things not known yet. One of the questions, and this could be a conversation, it can also be just a reflection moment, but what makes Chicago a sacred city? To have an initiative called Chicago Sacred implies that there would be something sacred about the city that would inherently make it worth this level of study. One of the reasons that, at least from a museum standpoint, seems like a pretty firm footing is the legacy of religious traditions within Chicago that are known. And so if you study Chicago history, World's Columbian Exhibition of 1893 is a really touchstone moment for most folks. And a legacy of that was the Parliament of the World's Religions, which is claimed to be one of the first interfaith gatherings of its kind in world history. So while there are many, many other things we could talk about, this, at least in the lens of looking at museums and collections, was a huge part of the legacy for justifying a jumping off point, let's say, for what makes Chicago a sacred city today. And that, again, is something that in part is a history justification and in part is a collections justification, because as a museum, if we're exploring what makes Chicago sacred, we want to understand that through the objects we have and the stories that we can tell. just looking at the Parliament of the World's Religions and 1893 Columbian Exhibition would not really do justice to the idea of something being sacred. Even within that, 1 year scope, you'll see a lot of conflicting definitions for what sacredness is. You'll see a lot of things about representation and power. And within that, there's a lot of legacy to be unpacking, and we'll do that as we kind of go forward. So we ask what makes Chicago a sacred city, but that also leads us then to ask about these things that we have in the museum, which is, what does it mean for an object or an item to be sacred? Because we'll have sacred places, but we'll also have sacred objects potentially, or objects that speak to a sacred history. And so this is the part where I go a little into theory, and so I'll try to be brief, but always happy to unpack this further. So this comes like a pretty obvious title to be referencing, right? Museology and the sacred. But this is something that I think is really important and links back to, like I was saying earlier, where, the more I do this work within museums, the more I'm realizing that kind of faith leader upbringing is really a part of this practice. So I'll just read this straight. The very notion of the sacred seems surprisingly close to some central themes in museology. The sacred, like intangible heritage, is manifested as practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith. That's a lot to kind of take in a definition, but I think the thing I want to take us into is right here, the international bodies that tell you what museums are talk about how there is a relationship between these physical objects and these intangible heritages, or these things that we can't know about the object without the action. And that becomes really important when we're talking about public history and community-centered work. So if you go to UNESCO, who is the international body that tells us what heritage is, they had a definition for intangible heritage was agreed upon by organizations in 2003. And this is a piece that I think gets really easy to be lost when we talk about heritage in general, and that's the community and relational aspect. And so for UNESCO, they say intangible heritage must be relevant to its community. It's based specifically on the idea that something is safeguarded through generations in ways that just the object can't do. And that's not to say it's static. And you'll see here this great phrase that they used, safeguarding without freezing. What does it mean to safeguard, right? And that's something that's a little different than maybe the word preserve, which is what we often use. So safeguarding or stewarding versus something that's preserving or almost like frozen in time. Just thoughts to be keeping in our head as we continue. In building terms, this would relate to something that we'd call living religious heritage, but I actually translate this into museology a bit, and you'll see why in a minute. But this idea that something is not, sacredness is something that has many translations, and we don't need to go into ontological definitions in this minute, but the idea that there's something that is transcendent about the practice. There's something that goes beyond what you can see. So if we take that into then the practice of museums, there's some really interesting ways people write and talk about what religious objects, and we'll just stick with the term religious objects for now. That's another thing we could unpack. But when you take a religious object and you put it in a museum, there's a process that things can go through that almost marks those that marks the transition. And I'm thinking of the process that, I was going to talk about in a slide later about working with American Islamic College and Dr. Hassan of bringing Elijah Muhammad's Fez. And we talked a lot about this process of what does it mean for something to go from the life that it's lived into a museum setting. And there are some theories around that. So one of my favorites is called euthanized sacredness. Favorites in terms of just call it what it is. Basically, they say it's dead now, right? This is a dead object. It's been preserved. That frozen in time comes into the collection. It's not what it was before. It's something new now. And that new identity is museum object. Another example could be what they call in the beholder's eye. So that really is more like a hybrid identity. So it's not saying, inherently it can't have a sacred quality, but it's not something that's being invited either. So if you come to a museum setting, you might see, let's say, a religious icon on display, and you might decide that that has sacred or religious value to you as the individual, but the museum isn't exactly uplifting it the same as it would have been in an altar or in another sacred space. The third has another great name, which is the zombie model. And this one is one in which use is at times invited and at times not. And part of that might have to do with the practicality of museum objects to be preserved need rest and things like that. But this is something that is a little more fluid, and it's something that is a little step beyond the beholder's eye, and that there's an invitation to interact or participate in a different way that might give some kind of knowledge of that previous life or those previous uses. There are lots of examples of different kinds of objects. I'll try to be brief about this because there's a lot to go through today. But there is something to be said, and this is David Morgan, who's a great scholar of material religion specifically. And the idea is that an object is not just an illustration of a religious truth. It's not just something that you can point to and say, this is an example of what I mean. He would argue that those objects actually are the substance of the religious tradition. And so again, going back to that inseparable practice. Robert Orsi is a local scholar to Chicago, and an important part of the practice that he discusses is the idea that urban religion is something distinctive. So if we shift away from just the objects themselves, but the setting in which religion is happening, things that are happening within Chicago in an urban setting is a distinctive thing. And this cuts really closely to these categories of power and things like white supremacy about what are the religions that we uplift. And in the framing that we talk about the museum, we use the phrase Christian normativity, and the need to shift away from Christian normativity for when we talk about what a religious history of the city is. This relates directly to this great book. It is in limited edition, so they're hard to come by, but if you're ever interested, you're welcome to come look. This is called The Place of Religion in Chicago, and these were geographers that tried to map all of the religions in the city about circa 2000s. This is pre-Google Maps. And I understand there are folks that are doing this now with kind of the new technology with us. But this is really talking about, the actual physical things around the city, the very places religion is happening, does inform both the practice that we see, but also, again, how those histories are understood, how they're preserved, how they're transmitted, and again, how that then informs what an example like us as a museum might know religious history to be, and therefore could also help us better understand where the gaps are that we could be addressing. And I won't go too deep into religious geography today, but an example in Chicago, many folks may know or may not know, but Catholic parishes are absolutely foundational to the physical geography of the city. And so we might think mapping out religious places can lead then to an understanding of, let's say, religious, cultural, socio-economic understandings of the city. And these are themes that get picked up in many, many places and inform the actual physical fabric and city planning of the city today, and leading to things like the work of Folded Map, which is trying to tell you about the inequities we see. All of these are part of the same legacies in many ways. So just a couple more things about religion, and then I'll jump into the work at the museum. If we were to take then these things about inequity and representation and things that get lost over time because we don't understand them, there's a benefit to the museum in that we do preserve and can act as stewards. And so when these things are identified and we do listen to community and work through the process of safeguarding these heritages, the phrase that they use in this Religion and Museums book is iconoclastic action. So on the street, that might mean, destroying something. And here, the museum is kind of a space or a safe space for acting against that iconoclasm. Let's see, I'm sorry, I'm going to try to move us forward just a little bit. But this last piece, this is actually a really new publication that talks about, again, these themes of things in museum spaces. But just talking about the need to integrate what we see in the museum with the people that experience these religious objects, and how things that are preserved have new life as we maintain these relationships around the objects in our collections. So going into the lens of what Chicago Sacred does, I'm going to talk a little bit about the legacy of the museum. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of what we do at Chicago Sacred, and then I'm going to try to give some examples of what we have of what we've been implementing or, different projects that we've taken on as the museum. So in addition to the history of Chicago as a religious city, Chicago History Museum itself has a legacy of really not only working with community, but working with community around religious identity. And so that made us a good space to do this work in an ongoing way and commit to it in a new way. And so I have 3 exhibitions here I'm just going to mention really briefly, and then as time allows, we can talk a little bit more. But they were called the Abrahamic Suite at the time. And the first was on the Catholic history of Chicago, which opened in 2008. 2012, they opened an exhibition called Shalom Chicago, which focused on Jewish histories. And then most recently in 2019, American Medina, which focused on Muslim histories of the city. American Medina was open a bit longer. It was open until 2021, but it was unfortunately cut short for physical visits due to COVID. So there's a lot of material from American Medina I tried to include today because it might be less familiar to folks that weren't able to see it in person. So just a quick run through what Chicago Sacred as an initiative is. It's one thing to say like, oh, we talk about religious history and we're talking about museum objects. What does that actually look like on a day-to-day basis? I thought it might be helpful to kind of understand the work holistically first. So as I mentioned, we have these legacies that were kind of used as the justification for how Chicago and religion are important histories to discuss. And then I mentioned, there are histories embedded within that have been uplifted and others that are less known. And I use the phrase Christian normativity because even for the Parliament of World Religions, if I go back a slide, the historic framing for this was a largely Christian lens, even though it was uplifted as an interfaith gathering. And so to really unpack and better understand those legacies takes a lot of work. So an example is we have Red Man's Rebuke in our collection, and acknowledging that there's a very strong understanding of something that is sacred well before religion came to Chicago is a huge part of understanding what sacredness in the context of museums are. And it also is a very important way of us remembering, sacred definitions can be very, very community specific when we think about what a sacred or religious legacy might be. So for me, like the guiding principle of the work that I do is this question: what does it mean for a museum gallery to transform into an interfaith space? And I say interfaith space because I think a huge part of that is the facilitation of dialogue. So not a multi-faith space, not a space where we just happen to have things about different religions, but truly something that is about the dialogue and the understanding of each other. We have these 4 principles that we've kind of laid out or identified as a way to talk about what the purpose of having this interfaith space might be. And as an educational institution, that's really to promote religious literacy. And religious literacy has a lot of definitions. There are many different understandings. This is Harvard Divinity Schools, which is a good basis. There are things we can add to and better clarify. But one of the main things we try to really talk about is that there's something different when we're talking about studying religion versus a religious expression. And again, that goes back a bit to what I was talking about intangible heritage. That would really be the expression. That's different than trying to talk about, the diverse ways in which a specific religious tradition could be expressed in the world. That would be the critical study aspect. Another thing that's really important, and the 3 projects I mentioned, American Medina, Shalom Chicago, and Catholic Chicago definitely addressed this, but religions are internally diverse. So that means just because we're talking about Catholicism as an example, or Islam in another setting, does not mean that there is still not a lot of diversity to address. And when you think about that through an interpretation lens, that means there's a lot of ways you can get it wrong too, because lots of people have, their version of what they think or believe. And going back to that, what is critical study versus expression becomes really important. Another piece is we're a history center, right? We're talking about history. Things change over time. So we might talk about something that happened in the 19th century that theologically has shifted quite a bit within a tradition today, but doesn't necessarily mean the historic aspect was not important. And so contextualizing those evolutions is really important. And then finally, and this is the part that I get really excited about, the idea that religion is embedded in all areas of human activity, which is to say, I'm not going to just look at churches and mosques to talk about religious history. It's everywhere. And the more that we look at that work, the more we see it, as I'll show you in a couple slides. And so in order to kind of create, again, the justification for a full-time person doing this all the time, in addition to the rich history we see around us, the collection itself has 23 million objects, as I said at the start. And so we've been doing an ongoing inventory that started before I did, looking at and assessing how our collections speak to these different identities across a really wide range of things. And that might be religious tradition, it could be ethnic identity, it could also be location, geographically around the city. And again, really just trying to understand where the bias has been and how we can do better in being more holistically representative of what we see around the city. And so I look at this as the process of inventory, or looking at our archives and collections, is really a relationship building exercise, because I can't feel like I'm doing justice to the relationships we're building if I don't know what we have. If I want to invite somebody in to share their perspective, having this as a tool to share is really our goal as a museum. That's why we take objects in, is so that folks know we have them. So nitty gritty stuff, like I said, that means physically inventorying objects, so that's going through and saying, okay, this is what I thought it was, or, this Diwali cup that came from Devon, this is what it looks like, and we know which store it came from. In the context of our 2D collections, which would be our archival materials, a lot of things lack metadata, which is really just describing words to fully understand what things are. So again, physically going through things helps us better understand what is actually in these folders, to know, who else might be have a point of connection to this history that we didn't know was there. We have digital resources, so while we have a website, we also have things like digital exhibits, Encyclopedia of Chicago, which is, a resource specifically on different topics, kind of like a Wikipedia, but for Chicago. Going back to intangible history, oral history is a really center part of public history work. So we have not only oral history projects that we've taken on as staff, but we also retain the Studs Terkel oral history archive. And so, hundreds, if not thousands, of interviews around all of these topics as part of that. We also do communications work. So I say this is a bit of like an audit to our inventory process, where we're trying to introduce the idea that religious topics are just a normal part of everyday life. There's a cadence to it that's just fitting into the rhythm of anything else we do. And so sometimes I write them, sometimes we have interns write them, other colleagues, but it's really a way of saying, hey, we found these things in our collection and we want to share them with you. And we'll do that through the context of something that's just happening, so we all feel a part of what's going on right now. Also, that can lean into programs. So these are just a handful of some of the partner programs or public talks or places that we talk about this history. And, again, this is just in a couple of years trying to build up framework and capacity for that. So I'll pause for a second, because I had an idea, and you can tell me this is good or bad. But I thought, I told you we do this, but I decided to try it out this afternoon to see what I could do for American Islamic College today. Because if we're building relationship through archives, I thought, well, it's honest of me to show up with what I could find, right? So I did a search of all of our images. American Islamic College as a phrase brought up exactly one thing, and it was this image. So I have typed out for you exactly what we know about this image. All of the information that I could find that was in our digital database is sitting right here. Students sitting and studying at American Islamic College in 1987, and this was a photo taken by James Newberry. To try to build relationship around something like that can be really challenging. So as a researcher, I'm going to do my best to try to build more context, right? Having been to your building, I know, hey, wait a second, you're in a converted Catholic building. That's right. So if I look up Immaculata High School, I find a few more things. We have archival drawings by Barry Burns. We have a few things about the historicity of the building. This is where that metadata part becomes really key. This is what our holdings say about that building. You'll look and you'll see the words that we've associated with that space that AIC has called home for decades, right? And none of them would allude to the identity of that building for the last, 40 years. As far as we know, this is a Catholic space that was a convent and a women's space. And that's about it. that would show an example of the work that we need to do around our collections to better know what these spaces have been through time, and who else might find this kind of information interesting or insightful. Another example I'll dig into is another clue I was given is, oh, this is a Newbery portrait. Okay, I know we have a collection of these Newbery portraits. Sometimes I can learn more, sometimes not, by looking at the context of these other portraits that were taken. So James Newbery was a photographer that did a whole series of kind of multicultural Chicago in the 80s and 90s. And these have very sparse metadata on our end. So again, I'm showing you another example that was in the context of the photo we had for AIC. And this is all the information that we were given. Middle Eastern family, 1987. Who is that family? What's the space they're in? Do we know their names? How about those statue or trophies in the background? You know, somebody in sports? Like, there are so many things we do not know looking at this photo. And I'm going to share with you an example of what happens when public history does its best. So this is another portrait from the same series of photos by James Newbery. And we actually had this one on the inside of the museum. As you walk in, there's a series of portraits. The metadata on this looked a lot like the portrait that you saw before, and it actually had the family misidentified. And so we received an email from somebody who was a visitor to the museum, and they said, you know, I would like to talk to somebody. My family is misidentified as Iranian. We're actually Palestinian. Here's our name. Here's me. You know, this, now we know this is the Al Jazara family. We know that they're Palestinian. We know why they came to Chicago. We know what they're wearing. We know where they're sitting. And it's because somebody took the time to reach out to us. And that takes a lot of effort. That takes a lot of fortitude for somebody to approach a museum and tell them they got it wrong. And I'm very grateful for when people do that, but I also acknowledge that not everyone feels safe to do that. And so, you know, in public history, I think it's really important that we understand that this is an ongoing conversation around our collections, and we only build relationships through honesty. You know, so who are those folks sitting in the prayer space of American Islamic College in the 1980s? I don't know, but maybe other folks do. I'm going to give just a really quick run through because I wanted to highlight American Medina as a project, and then I'll probably pause there just given for time, and we can either have a conversation or I can bring up some other things depending on how we're feeling. The three projects I talked about though in the Abrahamic Suite, these all were projects that were centered on, you know, a specific religious tradition, very diverse within each, but certainly kind of in that model of a community by community engagement. As I said, with Chicago Sacred, a lot of the work we're trying to do now is interfaith in approach, meaning that this model is one we're shifting away from a little bit. But what's great about what these projects did is they created a vocabulary for the museum to talk to communities about these topics and think about ways that we engage visitors in learning about traditions they may not know as much about. And so Catholic Chicago, very briefly, you know, while it focused on obviously Catholic traditions, it used teen historians to conduct about 40 oral histories that was very diverse in its nature. And so it really dug into the many like material and intangible ways that Catholicism has taken place. And something that I really appreciated reading reviews of this exhibition, the space that you see right here is actually like different components of different Catholic worship spaces. So this is not an actual worship space. It's a simulacra, if you will. But responses to this were really interesting. Some folks would come in and sit on the pews and say that it felt like a worship space to them. Some people would just walk in and treat the room like objects. And so having those kind of varied experiences while being in the space, I think kind of spoke to that hybrid identity I mentioned earlier, where, you know, the museum just presented artifacts and then people engaged based on their own experiences or what they brought with them into the space, whether they saw that as something religious or sacred to them. Shalom Chicago did not have oral histories, but it does focus a little bit on this conversation around everyday life and religion. So for example, they really unpacked things like kosher food laws and how that would affect where you would eat in the city, or, you know, where you might walk in a day based on your own religious practice. And so what I really appreciated that is it made you think about all the places religion shows up that you might not expect it to. And so American Medina really blended the two approaches. And so American Medina is centered in oral history. This was curated by Peter Alter, our chief historian and director of our Studs Terkel Oral History Center. And this has over 140 oral histories of Muslim Chicagoans. And then it also delved into, a lot of the history of many, many communities around the city. So just a few examples I'll go through somewhat quickly here. Examples of ways that this took place. So that included having teen historians again, because we really see oral history as a tool for social justice, and teaching youth how to, engage in that history directly is a really critical part of that work. We had artist activations as part of the exhibition, so that, inviting people in to interpret history in a contemporary way. There were a number of different kind of didactic elements of this. So part of that was the history, right? Let's set the tone around the different communities and places that have been established kind of through history. This goes back to the 1893 Columbian Exhibition as the starting point. I think there's lots of conversation we could have about that being a starting point, but it is true that as far as historians know, some of the oldest purpose-built mosques in the country were at the 1893 Columbian Exhibition. And so, marking that as a new way to occupy physical space is certainly something worth uplifting. And, again, collection items that just spoke to that, places around the city that speak to those histories, calling out certain vocabularies or persons so that this was something we could, again, as an educational institution, invite people into so that they had a sense of what these words or names mean as they go through the exhibit. Activities. So, I'm a tactile person. I love when an exhibition has something I can touch. So, blocks that you get to build or draw something, or just different ways of understanding how Islamic culture informs many different areas that you may not be aware, like art and architecture. Another thing that I thought was really compelling is really trying to talk about, both the historic community places and also how things shifted over time. So starting, with the Columbian Exhibition and really the shift into the suburbs over time, and also just the really diverse and numerous places that this has taken place. And so having maps as part of that, again, definitions of reflection, so folks feel engaged and a part of it. So even if you're not Muslim, you can think about what faith is, you can understand how these things embody themselves. And then talking about, tough topics that are a part of religious traditions, like what does anti-Muslim racism look like in a city? And that's something that's, brought up consistently in oral history interviews. So this is just a screenshot of an interview, but like I said, over 140 oral histories as part of that. And then objects that were lent by community members. So I, of course, wanted to give a nod to Dr. Hassan today, but for example, things like this that community members trusted us with to steward for the run of the exhibition. Dr. Hassan has trusted us even further by now donating it to the museum, but it was initially a loaned object for the exhibit, and spoke to some of the pieces that we had in the collection like this. These are all Chicago History Museum photos and ephemera. But that process of building trust. And so this is from that exhibit or the donation event that we held together at American Islamic College last fall. Time permitting, I was going to play just a little bit of this video. Do we have time, Ramona? Okay, I'll play just a couple minutes. We won't run through the whole thing, but this is a video that just summarizes the project, and it's through the voice of the teen historians, which is a much better voice than mine to talk about the project. So I'll give us just a minute of it.
We can't hear it.
Oh. My apologies. It says that I have the output on my end, so that's okay. We can skip it for now, and I can certainly send a link to it later.
Yeah, if you don't mind, you can
yeah.
drop the link in the chat.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm so sorry, everyone.
No worries.
we think we checked the tech and then 2 tech issues already. But yes, I'll certainly share it in the chat. But the point of that is just to say, this is something that was really driven by the perspectives of these teenagers who did these interviews, and a reflection of their process of participating and seeing, their communities, their identities as part of the project. Okay. Let's see if I can get myself back. All right. I'll pause there before going on to any other examples of things. Just to see how we're doing on time and also provide space for conversation. And yeah, otherwise we have many more slides because I never come short on slides. So
Thank you so much, Rebecca. No, that was very informative. Thank you so much. And that was neat to see what you found on AIC. That was, I recognize that was, I think, maybe the masjid area. But yeah, if open it up to the floor if there are any questions. Dr. Timothy, you have your hand raised.
Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca. This is actually really, I shouldn't say actually, it's really stimulating, and my brain cells are kind of firing now, and I'm wondering, do you think that this kind of curation and this kind of museum work really calls into question what a museum actually is? Because it seems to me that a museum, somewhat like scholarship, presupposes a kind of distance between the preservation of artifacts and the role that those artifacts might play in one's spirituality or religious life, or the meaning that it might convey. And I'm, you mentioned already in Catholic Chicago that there were certain people that would sit on those pews and maybe even have a kind of quasi-religious experience. And now you're, what really is the technical difference between an artifact and a relic, and how, as a museum scholar and curator, how do you, is that something that you wrestle with? And if so, like, what is a museum at the end of the day? And is that definition changing, especially in light of this kind of curation and this kind of collection, really? Because there will be some people who see some of your collection as being spiritually infused, religiously charged, maybe even like talismanic, sacred objects that carry a particular kind of spiritual power. And so how do we do that? And so that's one question. The other question is, well, then in your work, how are we defining religion as well? For example, the Shriners, the 1912, whatever it was, Medina Temple, downtown, or not quite downtown, but on the near north side, like, is that a religious structure, or does the Shriners community not really qualify? Like, how are we even defining religion in this process for you as a historian and as a museum scholar and curator?
Before you get there, I'd like to say 2 things that you might answer together for this. Because as you know, the word museum always fascinated me. But going around the world and just looking at the objects in a hurry, an hour in a museum, and coming back, and what Dr. Timothy was saying about it, that what does that tell you? So the concept of religion and humanity to be infused in it, and especially Chicago community, had always fascinated me. And these thoughts were in my mind when I was walking around for the Chicago Medina, and they did a great job. So coming back to what I want to say is that it not only will help us define the religion and how I am defined as a Muslim woman, by certain things have no meaning for my real spirituality and my real understanding of that. So I think all of these things will be very clear for us to know. And probably we'll all recognize how learning about each other's so-called religion is. And religion in practice looks like the culture that is portrayed all over the place. How you dress, how you live, how you treat each other. And that way humanity will come around. And American Islamic College, the relevance is there.
Mhm.
Okay, go ahead, because I just had to say that, and you put me there, so I'm history there, so it's okay.
Of course. Thank you for asking the two biggest questions possible. What is a museum and what is religion? So I appreciate that. We're just going to get right into it. Let's see. I'm actually going to start with religion, if that's okay. I'm going to flip it. And not because I expect to answer it fully, but more just a conversation around how we could approach it. And so there are a few things, let's say, that are a legacy I walked into for the definitions, and then kind of operational functionality answers. And then there's, an esoteric thing that we could shift into if time permits. So the legacies that I walked into, for example, Shriners are included in that inventory that I listed, and part of that is really interesting, and there's a whole conversation to be had about Orientalism and religion within that, and why certain things are included and others are not, when it comes to Western representations of another. And so unpacking the representations of other religious traditions is a big part of the legacy of the collections of the World's Fair.
That's a good word, unpacking, yes.
Yeah, and what I will say is I think it is equally important to uplift instances of, let's say, self-determination and ownership within those collections too, though. So like, I actually think it is very important to say the mosques there were in operation. They were close to the public while prayer was happening. That shows a positionality that perhaps would otherwise remove the agency that folks experienced while within the tension of a very Orientalist othering setting. And so because of that, I do still uplift those objects knowing they have a tension within them in terms of legacy. And so the inventory itself, when we're talking about religion, having both religion and community became very challenging to say there's a limit to what we could be looking at. And so there is a guiding principle, based on Pew Research and other, Harvard would be another example of definable traditions that the inventory was initially based on. And, I think it's somewhere between 40 and 50 kind of sub-definitions of religious identities that addresses. It's a helpful starting point, at least to have a limiting factor. When we go into community identity, I started choosing to look at that geographically or spatially. Because Chicago is known as a city of neighborhoods, because those neighborhoods become community areas, and because a lot of how Chicagoans see themselves is so tied to that identity, I thought that was another fair, at least layer to consider within how we're defining those two things. And so if you looked at, the inventory that we have going, you'll see kind of these crisscrossing of those two things. So, if we took American Islamic College photo as an example, I could say, okay, well, this is both Catholic as well as Muslim, but within those two things, there's going to be a lot of specifics we can add. In addition to that, then we could say spatially, okay, we're in Irving Park. We could say, or, location, we could start mapping community area. We can now, delve into the architect, all those kinds of things. And so between those, we start to kind of close in on something that we would include in the list. And I think the purpose for me for those, like I said, is really about relationship. I don't feel like I'm doing my job well if I don't know what somebody could learn about themselves when they come to the museum. And so if I don't know that answer, I'd like to find out, or I'd like to at least invite them to show me what they know that I might not know. For example, if I'd never been to American Islamic College and you guys said, hey, did you know that's what we are when we look at these like Catholic buildings, the way that the Al Jazara family did, and said, hey, we're Palestinian, please identify that correctly. That's part of the work. And so that's why I say like religion and community are two terms we're self-defining as well as relationally defining, because how somebody in a Pew Research setting defines a religious tradition might be different than somebody who's practicing that religion and the line that they would draw. And so that can be very, very relational and item specific. So yeah, that would be like the museum collection standpoint. I think religion as a definition gets really messy as soon as we shift away from religion and shift into the more spiritual sacred side. Because spiritual sacred is a whole different thing to a lot of people than religion. And there's a whole set of slides we won't get into now, but we've been doing different visitor and non-visitor surveys around what people want to see at the museum. And a lot of that has to do with, various things that we feel like we know are missing, but it's nice to hear from folks and have affirmed. And it is not untrue that actually there is a growth and interest in wanting to see religion represented in history spaces. And that's predominantly in younger generations, predominantly Gen Z. But beyond using like the specific word of religious traditions, you will see a lot of interest in very adjacent words. So that might be food traditions, that might be festivals, that might be parades, that might be celebrations. So all of these words that, if you're a religious historian or scholar, are part of religious tradition, but you're not going to define them under religion because that can feel really limiting to people. And so that's where the sacred and spiritual starts to fit in a little bit. Again, going back to an individual collection object, that is hugely relational. I can think of examples for definitions of sacred. One that I usually hold just, from my religion studies days is set apart, right? So the idea of something being sacred is something you've kind of marked as special. But another word that gets used a lot, and especially in the context of Native American and Indigenous collections, is secret. So to be sacred is something that's so internal that no one else should know about it. Well, those are two very different operations, right? To be set apart is almost to uplift it and to make it known. And then for something to be secret is really like an inner community understanding. And so what I might assume is sacred might actually be secret, and needing to learn that along the way is really important. I've gone on quite a bit about that, so maybe I'll save the esoteric for a second. Is that fair?
Let's hear from
Okay.
Timothy, because we can, what is religion and going around the world and going in the mosques, synagogues, and not so many synagogues, but mosques and churches, I found that space had a meaning of its own.
Yeah.
Can talk all day about that. You know what I mean? That
Absolutely.
water, presence of courtyards like that. The squares, geometrics, all these kind of things. So go ahead, Dr. Timothy, because it can serve as a real some course that can be offered to the architects and to the people who are working in fields of religion.
Absolutely. And that speaks to the idea that action is what makes something sacred, right? A room could just be a room until you pray in it, and now it's a sacred space. So how you translate that to objects is really challenging, especially objects you're supposed to be preserving, and preserving usually means as little action as possible.
That inspires a human being to act a certain way. Take a deep breath and think about God and walk in, no matter what space it is, whose it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose that brings us into then what is a museum?
Yeah.
Which is the second other very large question to be thrown my way. Yeah, what is a museum? It's interesting because in buildings, there's a lot of tension in historic preservation between the terms conservation and preservation, which is actually something that goes back to like the founding of the national parks, right? This idea that to preserve something is really to keep it in amber. It's something pristine that you don't touch. And then to conserve something is related, but you're really moderating change. So what that means is that you understand something can't stay static. So you are acting as the negotiator for what the amount of change is that's appropriate. And so like my general philosophy with building certainly has always been on the conservation end, where I think the change is essential or else it no longer holds meaning, because if you're not interacting, you forget about it. And so you as the individual will bring meaning just by showing up to it. And as soon as we don't, that's when we forget our history. And so, you know, in the example of buildings, churches that become mosques, you know, there might be a lot of change that needed to happen to facilitate prayer in a space that used to have pews and balconies that now needs, you know, a flat floor. How do we talk about what the value is within that, and who decides what the line is of the appropriate amount of use that can facilitate? That was a really important conversation for me. And so when I think about that museum objects, you know, that has a tension that is both internal and external, you know, because we're a museum, we're accredited, we have standards, there are international guidelines for what we need to do to best preserve history that we want to ensure we're following. And we also are accountable to the communities of the objects that we hold, in my mind. They've entrusted us with that history, and to entrust us with it means to activate it, as in they should know we have it. And that creates a danger, I think, because once somebody wants to care about history, you don't know what they'll do with it, right? You can't keep it secret forever. Somebody has to know about it. And so knowing about it means using it. And so now that's where the curator as facilitator becomes really important. You know, sometimes you could use the word bridge building, that might be true. You know, there might be lots of ways to think of that role, but the role is one that, for me at least, you know, that's what I hope to see us being, is in part repository, but in part ally and, you know, kind of sponsor for other people to know their own history. Yeah, I hope that's somewhat of an answer.
Thank you
It
so
is.
much. It is.
Yeah, no, it's a great answer. Go ahead, Ramona, sorry.
No, go ahead, Dr. Timothy.
No, there may be others who want to come into the conversation, so.
Are there any other questions?
I think you're in the right place, and be together in the right place, meaning and knowing one another, a better journey.
Can I ask a question, Rebekah, with regard to indigenous North American collections? I'm sure that the kinds of questions that we're raising today have been anticipated already, or already are familiar to those museums that contain significant indigenous North American collections. And so what does the historian or the curator do when a community wants to come and have a devotional ritual or a devotional event within a curated space or within a museum space? Because as we know, many of the artifacts that have been collected with reference to, you know, indigenous traditions were actually sacred and are still sacred to the people, from whom they were, you know, they were either taken or bought or procured in one way or another. And so what does a museum do when that's, and what kinds of choices does a museum have to make with regard to repatriation, or with regard to, does it change the way a museum regards its own collection and its own exhibit spaces and collections?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important conversation always, but especially this year, as I know laws have changed, you know, just this year. And so as an institution, it's absolutely something we have been thinking about. On the one hand, and I hate to almost say it this way, but sacred in the context of those kinds of objects has a legal definition, which is very different than a lot of the other contexts I've been talking about. So while there can be certainly challenges through, let's say, a repatriation process, there is a legal guidance that we follow for those kinds of things. I should say our collections that fall within that category are quite small in the scope of the 23 million we have, it might be a few hundred. And we have a great registration team that works through legal repatriation process for objects that are identified to fall within that. And, there's compliance and things like that museums like ours follow. And so that's certainly an arm of that conversation is there are these legal definitions we want to ensure we're in compliance with, we want to ensure we're doing right by that process. And then I think what tends to be the harder conversation are the things that fall a little outside the scope of the legal definition. And that's where relationship becomes really important.
Mm.
And like I said, an example is a sacred object. That could change with going back to, there's all these ways we could define religion, and there's a scholarly approach, there's a legal definition, and then there's ask an individual, and they might have a very different perspective on what a sacred thing is. So, thinking through that and trying to just be transparent with this is what we have, it's a big part of that process. And that's why things like inventory have been so important. Is to better understand what we have so we can build those relationships the right way.
Wow, thank you.
Beautiful.
Any other questions?
Lots of them, but we don't want to.
It's like, I'm here, but yes, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So
We can take one more question and then we'll close out.
Well, the objects you're talking about, they will have some visibility and people will be able to experience that. And that could help us define even the sacredness and all that. You see?
yes.
Because sacred has a very different meaning. When you go all over the place, they have, like body parts from historic, I don't like to even say it, but those things are there and they call it sacred. So sacred definition is like, you worship it or why it is sacred. It's close or sanctity or whatever it is. It's very complex for me. I don't get it.
It is very complex. I'll think of another example maybe I can propose. But I went to this really great conversation around Jewish sacred objects, because that would be another example, of a religious tradition. We've done a show on Jewish histories. There's some objects in the collection I was curious to learn more about. And for example, how you handle Jewish religious objects, there are rabbinic definitions for sacredness. And those are different, again, than the context of what sacred might be in other contexts. But for example, sacred text. So anything that would have the name of God on it is Klei Kodesh. It's the most holy. And below that, there are then, other categories. So like, for example, if we as a museum had an object like Teflon or a Torah scroll that has that name, and we knew it needed conservation or we were curious to learn more about it, there's a process that's respectful for addressing that within the context of what Klei Kodesh means to a Jewish community member. That would be us doing right by the process versus, we have a really great paper conservator who knows how to do lots of things, and it's a lot more work to do it with like rabbinical process in hand, and that kind of stuff. But having team members that are open to that conversation of like, hey, knowing this about that, what can we do to make sure we're honoring that the best we can through the process, is just yet again another example that falls into this grayer area. There's, to my knowledge, not the same legal definition that says we must do that in terms of Judaica in that specific way. But it feels like the right way to do it, the ethical way to do it.
And Jewish sacred object, how they treat Torah. It doesn't leave the premise and all those kind of things. Don't want to repeat all that, but what is that? Because of it's sacred, that's why?
Yeah, and there are a lot of, this would be another example, but there are a lot of traditions that believe sacred objects should be buried. They shouldn't go into museums at all. You know, what do you do with that then when one's in your collection? You know, and there are things like that within each tradition, and again within each individual, that is really important to build trust and understand. So yeah.
Interesting.
Thank you so much, Rebekah. This was really a very exciting talk. Really appreciate you spending time with us tonight and sharing with us all of the ins and outs of archival work and curating an exhibit, and you know, the definitions of how you all understand what it means to be a museum, and displaying with sensitivity you know, meaningful objects and meaningful stories. So thank you so much for sharing that. The Chicago History Museum is lucky to have you. And for everyone else, thank you for attending. And next Tuesday, we have another talk. It's going to be on religious authority in contemporary Islam and digital media disruption. So that will be an interesting topic as well to discuss. That's next Tuesday. So keep a lookout for the newsletter on that. And we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you again, Rebekah.
Thank you, Rebekah.
Thank you.